Thank you so much, and a really heartfelt thank you to those of you who are retired and are spending some time here, because it's spring. And, and yes, and Miss Becca here is retired too, and we miss her. But thank you for taking time out of your busy days and coming to hear me talk and spend time at the Montana Historical Society. So a few things before I get going. I realized as Julie was doing the introduction that I brought dress shoes to wear, but I forgot to put them on. And so I've got my tennis shoes on. It is what it is. And then there was some discussion about programs happening the rest of the week here. Tonight at 7, there is it sounds like a wonderful presentation, High Noon, the Hollywood Blacklist and the Making of an American Classic. And it's about Montana's Gary Cooper. So that sounds great. Tomorrow evening at 6:30, which is the weekly schedule for free programs, Thursday night at the museum, stopping along the way by our very own wonderful Ellen Baumler, and she's going to explore the long and wonderful history of the Sebin Ranch. So I hope you can make it. Now, most of your faces are familiar, but there are a few that are not. So I'm going to bore some of you with just a quick introduction to the Montana Historical Society. And I usually start this introduction by explaining, I do not work for the museum. And there are some people that go, what? That's because the Historical Society has 5 dynamic departments. There is the museum, and they are responsible for taking care of the artifacts and the stories that accompany these artifacts. There's the outreach and interpretation, which is education. It's huge, but they help get the stories out there and bring stories here, right? State Historic Preservation Office, they take care of our archaeological sites. They're in charge of the National Registry here in the state, and on and on. Publications, self-explanatory. They put out our wonderful journal every quarter and publish books periodically. And then there is the Research Center, and that's my world. It is 3 parts. There's the library, which is the published material, including newspapers that date back to 1864. We've got over 95% of the newspapers ever published in Montana. Upstairs on microfilm. The archives have thousands of boxes of amazing things. Everything from the Cameron diaries to the Nolan records, Cornelius Nolan, who I got in his records because his wife was chairperson for the American Red Cross here in town. I also dabbled a little in some homesteader diaries to find out how the women were coping with their days. And I think they were just so exhausted they didn't worry about coping. They just ate and slept and got up again. Ate, slept, got up again. So archives, original material, they're the unpublished word. And then there's the photo archives, and you're going to see some of our photos up here. And then one more piece of bookkeeping. I have to thank Martha Cole. Many of you know Martha. She is wrapping up, well, I don't know if she'll ever wrap it up, but has finished a segment of a huge, wonderful project to commemorate the centennial of World War I. And I shamelessly borrowed from her images and some of her text. So when you see her, tell her, Zoe shamelessly borrowed from your images and text. Okay. So I feel humbled today and very nervous because this is a huge topic. It's not as simple as, oh, there was a war and women had to pitch in. And you're going to find out why, whether you like it or not. Okay, there's no way of simply just jumping into what women were doing with their non-existent spare time during World War I without getting into different components. And so we're going to go through the progressive era, and I'm going to define that for you. The World War I is, for the nation, the end of the progressive era. In Montana, it lasts a little bit longer. Then the war, both abroad and at home. The politics and the patriotism. And if you're not familiar with Montana, suffice to say, people went a little crazy. Then survival at home and the contributions that women did. But surprisingly, they were expected to do this. There was an amazing amount of social pressure on everybody during this time. Okay. First, the progressive era. And this is a really interesting era. It's probably my favorite era to talk about as a historian. Because as we go into the progressive era, which started, give or take, around the Depression of 1893, and is considered by many scholars to end about the time that World War I ends. Here in Montana, we have another progressive governor, Dixon, and so I consider Montana's progressive era lasting a little bit longer. But the progressives were really interesting people. And they're very dynamic people. It's really hard to define them. And so I just have listed some of the characteristics that you would have found with progressives. I want you to remember that this is 1917 or thereabouts. And the world has made a huge bunch of transitions in the last generation. We have railroads that bring in newspapers. And of course, the telegraph has been around, but newspapers. Saturday Evening Post, the Delineator, all these amazing magazines. People are getting news faster than they ever had before. Does that sound familiar? So many of our communities throughout the country have gone from wonderful, seemingly isolated communities, and they know there's a world out there, but it's quiet and they're not bothered much with bam. We have news coming every day on the train. We have new people coming every day on the train, and that's vital to remember as we get into this period. New people, new citizens, immigrants coming to Montana every day during this period. So that's what's going on in our little towns, but the progressive era is a result of just the changing industrial, social, and political scene of the United States. One of the things that I hold near and dear about the progressives is that they believed in education. And quite honestly, they thought that all of society's ills could be saved or resolved by creating an administration for it, a department for it, putting educated people in there, and then having them control the rest of the population. And therein lies one of the little interesting characteristics about progressives. They thought nothing of control, social control. And they were suspicious of people who were a little bit different on many levels. But ultimately, they were responsible for women's suffrage, labor reform and unions, child labor laws. Strong middle class was established during this time. The respect for education, the scientific approach to business and to politics, medicine, public policies, so public health protection. The Pure Food and Drug Act. They are responsible for introducing that great concept of eugenics, prohibition, social control, and this wonderful idea of allotments where the reservations are chopped up and the sections are sold to the Europeans that are coming here. So there's the progressive era. As you know, Montana's women got the vote earlier than most of the nation, and we can be very, very proud of sending the first woman to Congress, and of course that's Jeanette Rankin. So we have all these idealists running around. Then, getting back to our little communities. For years and years, those newspapers and the Saturday Evening Post and all these other bits of news have been giving us blow by blow, which it would have seemed, information on the conflict in Europe. And it's not long before we've got good guys and bad guys. We've got the Huns, we've got the, oh my gosh, I can't even repeat some of the names they called the Germans. But a new one I learned was squareheads. Yeah, I had to look that one up. So we've got, simply put, Great Britain and France and Russia against Germany, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, and more. But before the United States comes into this, it's important to remember we've had a huge influx in the last 10, 15 years before this of Bulgarians. Because Bulgaria was crazy too, of Germans. Things were not comfortable there, and people were looking for opportunities in the United States. So again, there's that immigration issue. And before the United States got into the war, we were supplying the Allies. And there was plenty of propaganda around to start Hooverizing, to start knitting, long before April of 1917 and the official U.S. involvement in war. And ultimately, the rationale to declare war did come from the very real fact that Germany was sinking U.S. ships. So now we've got the U.S. and Montana at war. Going into April 1917, Montana is booming because the rest of the world needs our resources. They are importing lumber from northwest Montana. They are importing lumbermen and forestry students from Missoula. They are after our metals, the coal, and oh boy howdy, the copper coming out of Butte. And then of course wheat and food, just food. Europe, comparatively speaking, isn't very big. And a good share of it is at war, not a whole lot of harvesting going on. And ultimately, as you know, over 10% of the Montana population goes to war, physically goes to war. And this is where we really start seeing the ethnic contempt, for lack of a different word, and it's not too strong a word. Evelyn Cameron, in her diaries, mentions on a rather regular basis German neighbors coming to her house and asking her to translate a newspaper into German so they know what's going on. And these aren't people who got here yesterday. And I can sympathize because I'm one of those people who I've had about 5 years of Spanish, and I still can only count to 5. It's hard to learn a different language. And so people who have been in the Lewistown, Fergus County area for years now are going to the store and they're hearing German being spoken. Wait a minute, we're at war with Germany. Where do their alliances lie if they can't even learn our language? All right, this is just an example of one of the amazing posters. During this time, by the way, advertising also comes of age. Now, we have to talk about the war at home. And I mean that. There is a war going on in the United States, and it is especially pronounced in Montana. And I've gotten, Okay. So, believe it or not, this is a photo of federal troops in Butte. There were federal troops, 5 or 6 times in Butte. They were brought in to make certain that the miners went to work. Because we're at war, it's the miners' duty to go to work. Of Coincidentally now, this is the time also where the miners are trying to unionize. We've got the IWW, International Workers of the World, coming in. In fact, I'm sure you've heard of Frank Little. He comes in I want to say August of 1917, is that right? Anyway, early fall 1917, gives one heck of a speech in Butte, and is that evening drugged from his motel room, beaten, and then lynched. That is the climate that people are reading about every day in the newspaper. So not only are our ancestors or our cousins at war in Europe, not only are our sons going to war and our husbands, but we've got a war going on here. So imagine being an Irishman, and even maybe a second or third generation here in the U.S. Irish historically aren't real fond of the British. And you've got federal troops telling you you can't unionize. You've got to get down there in that, it's not a pit, ugh. It's a hole thousands of feet down. Now, before Frank Little is lynched, we've got a lumber strike in Lincoln County. And it was one of those things we don't hear about much in Montana history, but it started a domino effect. It started in Eureka, Montana. They were striking for better pay, for safer conditions. A lot of men at this time were living in lumber camps. I can't even begin to describe the conditions that they were having to live in. And they went on strike. First in Eureka, and then it just started spreading. Pretty soon, Idaho and Washington, lumbermen are on strike. What happens? Federal troops are sent to Eureka, Montana. We have to have these men working. And they're being anti-patriotic by not working. So we've got federal troops in northwest Montana, federal troops in Butte. Then, during the course of this, we've got the Speculator Mine Fire, where 168 men are killed in a Butte mine. To date, it is one of the largest deep mine accidents in not just Montana, but the country's history. It's a horrific blow. Imagine 168 families without breadwinners. And then we've got people who have been asking for safer conditions, a little more money, and 168 men are killed. And they're saying, doesn't this bring attention to the fact that there should be some action taken for working conditions? Whew. Eventually, towards the end of the war, there's the influenza, and then the American Protective League. Oh boy, howdy. And again, there is a war going on in Montana. This is from April 1919, Glasgow Courier. Scarcely a dozen Montana citizens, aside from those in the organization, were aware. It is safe to say that in every Montana community during the war, there was an active secret force of volunteer agents who ferreted out disloyalty and aided mightily in the winning of the war. There is a war going on in the Homefront. All right. And then to understand just a little bit more, the Council of Defense. Now, initially, the Council of Defense is a program created at the federal level to help the flow of resources, especially agricultural resources, to make certain that farmers are planting all the ground they can, that they have all the seed they need, and then to make certain that that production is getting to where it needs to be. Make certain the wheat is delivered to the places who then will distribute it to our GIs, sorry, that term isn't up yet, to the doughboys in Europe and to our allies. Now this is a picture of the crowd in Lewistown, Montana, burning their German textbooks. And this happened a month before our Council of Defense passed some really stringent sedition laws. Eventually, we have 78 Montanans doing time because they spoke out against the government and or the war or the Red Cross or the Liberty Bonds or all of the above. Or they got paid that day and had too many beers. So the Council of Defense. We'll be mentioning that again too. All right. Now, let's start talking about women. And I'm going to read a little something to you, and I just realized it's Eureka again. The supervisors or chair people of the American Red Cross, and the American Red Cross was incredibly organized. Montana was divided up into districts, and then the managers of the districts or chairwomen went to communities to make certain that they were producing. And we're going to talk about that production here really quick. But District 1's management showed up to address the members of the Women's Club of Eureka in May of 1918. So the United States has been in the war officially for a year. And this is part of the speech. Working at high pressure, the American woman must take that she keeps physically fit, must take care that she keeps physically fit. In order to do this, she must re-standardize to meet the new conditions of war work efficiently. In their home, they must make new standards of time. Remember, where they click into daylight saving time. Evelyn Cameron didn't like daylight saving time. They must accept the new materials and equipment. They must plan schedules and dispatch. They must re-standardize their recreations, but not do without. Re-standardize clothing. You have been compelled to do so with your food and money. Re-standardize your physical condition, your hours of sleep and relaxation. If need be, reshape your mental attitudes. Get into a state of mental harmony and friendliness with your working conditions. And it is said, one will have at their command, there it is, a spiritual force and physical vitality undreamed of by those who do not thus standardize the spiritual and mental conditions. So a call to women. Now, interestingly enough, when a lot of us think of women's work, we've been left a lot of impressions by Rosie the Riveter of World War II. And things were much different in World War I. And there are certainly a lot of places where women had to step into those traditional male roles. And this is one of those slides that I shamelessly borrowed from Martha. This is a crew of women in Livingston, Montana. And let me read this. This title is 10 of the Dirty Dozen, Women Who Cleaned Engines in the Northern Pacific Railroad Shop in Livingston, 1918. This is pretty cool. With 21% of Park County men ages 18 to 44 serving in the military, new jobs opened for women in traditionally male fields. In Livingston, at the largest NP repair facilities in the Northwest, the railroad primarily hired women as office workers, but 24 women worked as engine wipers and yard workers. The union made sure that they were paid the same as their male counterparts. That's pretty great. So although the war created labor shortages, it failed to give women a change in their labor status. Any male jobs that they had, of course, were short-lived. There is, however, one of the collections that we have, a small collection. There's a brother writing to his sister, And he asks her about the shortage of males. And he mentions something about considering how many Montana men I'm living with right now. There's got to be a shortage. I even noticed female railroad workers on the railroad, the train trip to camp. And I thought that was really interesting. So we've got women taking over or substituting for men. But then we have the women who are going to take on everything else. And we're going to break this down into smaller parts. But quite honestly, if you've read Evelyn Cameron's diary, or any diary about homesteaders, or for that matter, urban women who are cooking from a coal stove and are volunteering any spare time they have already, it's hard to imagine what more these women could do. But they were asked to do more. And let's just refresh our memories then. We don't have modern kitchens. We don't have those beautiful, what is the, not Hoover, what's the brand name for those beautiful enameled stoves, wood stoves? Monarch. Very few women have those beautiful Monarch stoves with a warming oven up on top and the water reservoir here on the right. They were cooking with much smaller stoves. Here, Mrs. Cameron has one. Mrs. Cameron has a really fancy stove. Okay? But look at the stove she's cooking on. There's a little oven, and she's got her dishpan on the stoves to keep the water hot. It makes me sweat just thinking of it. So this is Carrie Dunn, 1902, on the ranch. So let's just refresh our memories. If you're the head of the household, you're doing housekeeping, you're preparing food, you're preserving food. If you're on the ranch, you're making certain, in the farm, you're making certain that root cellar is full going into winter. If you're in town, you're going to have some sort of garden, hopefully fruit trees, and you still got some preservation to do in the fall. You've got child rearing. You're the nurse. Women were the nurse. And then laundry, and that's laundry. Did I spell that right? Well, I don't know. Anyway, it seems to be one of the least favorite things in my reading. If you are out on a farm and ranching, you've got women, and in the 2 diaries that I was able to read, they keep track of how many eggs they get every day, because what the family doesn't use, they sell. And that's their pin money, or that's their money for survival. It's the only cash coming in during the year. So you've got milking, butter, cheese, chickens and eggs, market gardens, livestock care, picking rock. There was one wonderful diary entry from this time where she begins the day with, "The family did not have to pick rocks today. Slept in." And I don't know what slept in means, but my guess is it was just a joy not to have to get up and go pick rocks. So then you're picking rocks, you're getting the fields ready, you're plowing, you're raking, you're mowing, you're threshing. It just doesn't end. There was very little delineation. Women had their sphere in the family and home, but by golly, when the farm needed help, they were out there, harnessing horses, running the plows, etc., etc. So, there is an interesting story that came out a couple years after the war in the Dillon Examiner. And they had an article about a woman called Maggie Hathaway, and she winds up being in the state legislature. But they make a big deal about the fact that during the war, Maggie, who was a widow, didn't have any men on her place to help run it. It was just run by women. She can plow a straight furrow as well as come up with some legislation. And Maggie talks about the time of war. And she said the situation was so serious that we were called upon not only to produce more, but to conserve more. And this, too, is a pleasure and one in which every person may have a part in. In fact, it can only be made most effective when all members of the household are in agreement. I think it's easy for Maggie to say, I think she was living alone. In these days when new, and now we're still talking about the war, in these days when new combinations are necessary because certain foods must be saved, the women are doing their best to meet the demands, and men may aid greatly by smiling as the soldier boys do, even if they are not served their favorite dish. How interesting. This is a great time, an incredibly interesting time. So, we're at war. It's a time of real uncertainty and, quite honestly, paranoia in Montana. And everybody's busy anyway. But now we, as women, the women, are expected to start producing for the war effort. And there are very specific things that women are asked to do. The American Red Cross is, by this time, a huge organization. And it was actually nationalized by, what president? President Wilson. This is, again, borrowed from Martha. Right? This is a quilt made in Cascade County. And it was raffled off, and there was some question about whether it was legal or not because gambling was illegal. They raffled the quilt in April of 1918, so we've been at war for a year, raising a total of $1,060. In Kalispell during this time, members of the Century Club raised $2,000 for the Red Cross through their store in the Masonic Temple's basement. And the liberty-loving women, including one who had knit for soldiers during the Civil War, also met there to sew and knit everything from surgeon's gowns to socks. Now, we are very lucky here in the Historical Society because of the archives, and so it's like heaven for a researcher. And there were 2, maybe 3 wonderful collections from families in which the women had been chair people for the Red Cross in the area. And one of these was the Harriet Nolan collection. And from her collection, there is a report that she has submitted to describe what her chapter and the surrounding area have contributed to the Red Cross and shipped out for the war effort. Are you ready? So they're under different designations, but this is their 24,000 surgical dressings. And then under hospital and operating room, we have 3,700 sheets, 2,400 pillowcases, only 18 bedspreads. There are 480 desk cloths. There are 144 dish cloths. There are 468 scrub cloths, hot water bag covers, 100, ice bag covers, 94, tray cloths, so cloths to cover up trays in which people in the hospital are being served. 1,025, 1,200 napkins, almost 1,800 napkins made of old linen. The old and the new is separated. And then lunch cloths, 16, tablecloths, 16, washcloths, 1,600. Under miscellaneous, there were 800 comfort bags created, and comfort bags were little tote bags, for lack of a different term. Often they were made with oilcloth or something that had been treated so it was waterproof, and then they would be filled with soap, shaving supplies, cigarettes, anything. It was kind of like a necessary bag. So 800 of those went out. We've got pillows, oh my gosh, feather and others, 800. We have infants' layettes. Oh yes, and so now we're getting into the Red Cross also included in their wish list clothes for the Allies. So Belgium, France, they wanted clothes to be able to ship out to our allies. So we've got infants' layettes, 35 pieces each, 1,225. Booties for children, leather moccasins, patchwork quilts, bed-size bags, Afghans, knitted and woven, Bobby. Joke books, 500. And I kind of like that one. Patients' clothing. Are you ready for this? 1,200 pairs of socks and 1,300 knitted garments. That is just one section of Montana. And I really admire this woman because she is always in her letters, make certain that headquarters knows that it's not just Helena producing these items. Helena, Canyon Ferry, Hauser Lake, Alhambra, Clancy, Jefferson City, Flesher, Lincoln, Craig, Clemens, Guildman, Augusta, the list goes on and on and on. But what is really fun and interesting is the demand for knitting. And this postcard, again, I had seen it and heard about it, but I shamelessly borrowed it from Martha, is of Maria Drennan. And she wrote on this, knit 61 pairs of men's socks, 41 pair children for Red Cross, worked 1,600 hours. So what have you done with your retirement, Rebecca? There you go. Unbelievable. So there's another collection called the Neal Papers, and Mrs. Neal was also involved. And from her scrapbook, we've got this notice, knit, knit, knit. Such is the plea of the Red Cross. If you have already knitted 12 pairs of socks and 21 sweaters, go up to headquarters and get more yarn. If you haven't knit, let this be your last day before you learn the art. Holy smokes. It just goes on and on. And then there's a wonderful exchange between Mrs. Nolan and the women of Gilman. They have a fancy needlework club. And they write to Mrs. Nolan to report that the club is small and 3 of them have infants. And so they're feeling as though their time is limited. But what can we do? So Mrs. Nolan sends them yarn. And she writes, this is enough yarn for X number of socks. When you can get it to us, we really appreciate it. Like I say, no moment went by. Let's see, 6 hanks of yarn she sent. Enough to make 10 dozen socks. Let's see what other things I can find. Here's from Mrs. Nolan to the Northern Division in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Essentially find and close 20 khaki-colored sweaters and 60 pairs of light gray socks. Oh my gosh. All right. The next thing women were doing, in between the knitting and the sewing, is they were coordinating drives and parades. And this is a parade in Hardin. And by this time, we are not allowed, the people of Montana are not allowed to have any public get-together, such as a parade, without permission of the Council of Defense. But by golly, you better be buying your Liberty loans. And again, the Liberty Loan Department, for lack of a different term, well, actually, Liberty Loan Committees, were just as organized as the Red Cross. But they had a little bit different approach. So women were enlisted to go from house to house to make certain that people had committed to Liberty loans. And of course, the loans were to help pay for the war. But let me read you this. And this is out of the Columbia Falls newspaper. It is April 11th, 1918. We've been at war for a year. And they are telling the town that they're about to start the 3rd Liberty Loan Drive. To start the campaign has to raise $20,000 in this district for Uncle Sam and they are always setting goals. But that, when they say has to, They mean it. So the committee will be provided with data covering the financial rating of every head of a family in the territory to be visited, and allotments have been made, which each one is expected to purchase. Are you ready? While it has been estimated that each person should subscribe, there is nothing to prevent an oversubscription. Neither will the party called upon be told what his allotment is, his payment or commitment. But he will be asked to subscribe for as much as he cares to, and if the sum does not equal the figure estimated to be his share, the matter will be taken up in a different way. Now imagine what this is doing with neighborly relations.
So
Yes?
the men off to war and the women doing all this, so who provided the income? So they could buy them.
There's still a lot of men here. With Mrs. Noland and the other woman I mentioned, their husbands were here. Mhm.
And they were bankers? Or?
They were certainly upper middle class. Mhm. But good question. Okay, another part of women's lives. Sedition. The Council of Defense, backed by the legislature, created laws that forbid, gosh, I hope I wrote it down. Here, so clash between, and I put Patriotism because it's one of the few German words I know, an influx of immigrants, most of who could not speak English, conflicted with the belief that if they wanted to live in the country, the least they could do was learn English. And as I've already said, not much easier said than done. But people who could not speak English were a real presence here. And there were about, according to the 1910 census, there were about 10,000 Germans born in Germany here. About 8,000 Irishmen. So the Irish could often speak English, but the Germans usually could not. So their very presence just evoked stress. So this is the only woman who was charged and convicted of sedition. And she was in Custer County, and by the way, Custer County tried and convicted the highest number of seditionists. I think they tried 13 and 10 seditionists, including Mrs. Smith, and I'm sure her name was actually Schmidt. And her case is infinitely interesting because if you were to read the people testifying against her and her husband, you would think, oh my gosh, I know that old curmudgeon. They were complaining to neighbors about having to buy war bonds. He was, to say that he was a little undecided about his loyalty is probably a fair statement, and he just didn't have a filter. And I can't help but flash on the many cups of coffee I've had with friends, both conservative and liberal, since after Obama was elected and after Donald Trump was elected, because there were a lot of times when the people at those coffee clutches could have been taken away and tried for sedition, because we take these conversations for granted now. Uh-oh, must be time to wrap it up. So they were complainers. We all know them. We all know them. And they wound up in prison. And then, my personal favorite, Hooverizing. Herbert Hoover, who was going to be president eventually, was made not president, I want to call him president. Where's my notes here? I'm sorry. He was the National Food Administrator. So he was in charge of making sure that we had enough food at home and the soldiers had enough food overseas. So the propagandist posters that you've seen throughout this program, a lot of them come out of the Food Administration. But he set guidelines. And the guidelines were to help women be frugal. And oh boy, you should read the letters going to Jeanette Rankin and women saying, frugal? Our lives define frugal. And they want us to give up more. All right. But Hooverizing in Montana brings me to mind a cookbook that we have here at the Historical Society, produced in Hot Springs, Montana, by the Red Cross. And it's the only Red Cross cookbook produced during this time. And they talk about Hooverizing, but they have the most interesting names for a lot of things. And by the way, I have, for your cooking pleasure, copies of all of these recipes, as well as the introduction. And I am going to read the introduction. Are you ready? Our object in getting up this book wasn't for the recipes and money derived from the sale of book only, but we wish the book to serve as a memento of these stirring history-making times when we showed the world that each other that we could be true red-blooded Americans. All recipes and advertising were given, etc., etc. This is the first Red Cross wartime cookbook, and we sincerely hope it will be appreciated and accomplish the purpose for which it was intended. And oh boy, howdy. So we've got Woodrow Wilson's Hokie hash, Liberty salad, Hoover corn and Graham gems. Gems are like little muffins. Red Cross brown bread, peanut butter bread. And I have to tell you, that's the first on my list to try. Wheatless chocolate cake, Hoover pie crust, that's not on my list to try. And L.I. pickles, L.I.'s pickles. It's fascinating, fascinating. And one of the best stories, again, Martha and I had heard of this, but this is borrowed from Martha, is from Dan Cushman. He wrote Stay Away Joe, was raised on a really isolated homestead, and he remembered that his mother was baking Liberty War bread with substitute flours, and he said nobody could eat it, so she fed it the chickens, and we ate war bread only in a different form as white bread, eggs, and fried chicken, a good common sense replacement. Then Evelyn Cameron talks about going to a party. Let's see if I've got it. Going to a party and having a feast. And there's kind of a postscript. Mr. Hoover would not have liked this. So it's all over. It's just the war culture and this culture of watching what you do has permeated all of Montana and the women in Montana. All right. Fortunately, the 11th hour of the 11th day in the 11th month of 1918, we have the armistice. And I wish I could say that hard times would end, but that fall we'd been hit with the Spanish flu. There's the armistice. In Montana's future, we have to cope with veterans who are mysteriously hit with tuberculosis. Could be gas. Gold Star mothers, these are mothers and wives who have lost their men and are given money to go to Europe to see their gravesite. Drought hits. We see the fall of homestead economy, mass exodus from Montana, and then the creation of memorials throughout the state. Memorial Day, as a matter of fact. And just for the closing of the war, Evelyn Cameron doesn't hear about it until, let's see, she hears that it's coming to an end. She says, the Kaiser is descending his throne. The crown prince, as stated, will be crowned in a month or two. Armistice expected, arranged by now. So, and then she talks about, then she took 7 pounds of cabbage to Mrs. Ward, wrote a postcard. It's bright and still outside. Put coal and wood in, had lunch, worked in the garden, fed the calf and chickens. So life went on. The war was over, but life went on. But, interestingly, The women who are working for the Red Cross get a letter that's dated 2 days before armistice. And it states, the cessation of war will reveal a picture of misery such as the world has never seen before, especially in the many countries which cannot help themselves. The American people will expect the Red Cross to continue to act as their agent in repairing broken spirits and broken bodies. Peace terms and peace conditions will determine how we may best minister to the vast, stricken areas which have been harrowed by war. And in this great act of mercy, the heart and spirit of the American people must continue to be mobilized through the American Red Cross. So, on that note, I chose a happy picture, doggone it. So during this time, and quite honestly, women are always busy. You know, you have kids, you've got housework. I've never known, quite honestly, I guess I was raised in a German household, and if you weren't doing something productive, well, you just always had to be doing something productive. But this is an amazing time in Montana and the country's history. But I think it's vital to give credit where credit is due. We had a population that was so complex and diverse. And one population was having trouble accommodating the next, and vice versa, with this wonderful influx of immigrants. We had an increase in awareness of what was happening in the world. And we were trying to cope with that. And the world as we knew it politically across the Atlantic Ocean literally fell apart and was remade. And that's another presentation. And so there was paranoia in Montana. The Council of Defense went crazy. William Campbell, the editor of the Helena paper, stirred up so much unrest, it's hard to imagine until you've read one of his editorials. So the progressive era in World War I were critical periods in defining Montana. The politics, the social structure, economic structure, and the people's lives were in flux. But I want to remind you that ultimately I did hope to give you information on Montana's women. And do not forget that the women of Montana rallied to the calls for rationing, the American Red Cross supplies, the endless knitting, stepping into vacant jobs traditionally filled by men. In short, Montana women, as were most Montanans, were ready to commit every spare moment to the war effort, their communities, and ultimately their homes and families. So, this lovely picture is Evelyn Cameron, and I want to end with this. You notice they are in a teeny tiny cabin. Look at her stove. She's got bread raising. And it's a dirt floor, but they look content, don't they? And that's what ultimately what women wanted, was to be content and have their families saved. All right. I've got 2 handouts. One is a collection of the recipes that I talked about, and I want you to know they are Hooverized. And then the other one is we have a collection of about 300 letters written to Evelyn Cameron when she was in Congress the first time by Montana women. And this is Mary Murphy's article on the women. And you will soon find out that you can't classify all women. No 2 women during this time were the same. They had different aspirations, they had different families, they had different talents. They had different times a day where they could perhaps be knitting. Or perhaps they had arthritis and couldn't knit. But by golly, they stepped up. It's phenomenal, and we can certainly all be proud. So please take this. Mary does an amazing job of describing the diversity of women's letters to Miss Reagan. Yes, ma'am.
Is that the time when the knitting machine, the sock machine was made? You cranked it and the yarn went around?
You know,
or was that World War II?
I don't, Bobby?
World War I.
World War I? Okay. See, we've got the knitting expert in the back. I needlepoint. Yes, ma'am.